The CIA's paramilitary operations, such as the Bay of Pigs landing in 1961, are an important part of CIA and Cold War history. Regarding the question of why the intelligence agency found itself conducting this type of operations, many scholars, such as Richard Immerman, have diagnosed a militarization or paramilitarization of the CIA over its history that was allegedly caused by the creation of the so-called Office of Policy Coordination, OPC, in 1948. This organization was responsible for covert operations, and it was part of the CIA administration. According to Immerman and others, it was the OPC leadership under its chief, Frank Wisner, who pursued to build a covert action empire and therefore strive to acquire and then expand paramilitary capabilities for a hot war, and thereby laying the historical foundation for the CIA's extensive involvement in the paramilitary field over the following decades. However, the orientation of the OPC toward peacetime or wartime requirements was actually the subject of a profound conflict within the US government during the CIA's early years, one that has been neglected in my opinion. So today I'd like to discuss the following questions. Why, how, and with what effects did this conflict over the OPC's mission profile evolve during the period 1948 through 52? I will not focus on operations, but on bureaucratic conflicts and organizational history. So my presentation will take these 4 steps: the initial administrative setup in 48, then US defense plans for Europe and their impact on paramilitary operations, which is, I think, the main driving force or the crucial driving force behind the paramilitarization of the CIA. The following debate in 51, and then solution and some long-term consequences. So I use the term paramilitary operations, but to be more specific, these early debates centered on the capability for guerrilla warfare, meaning the recruitment, training, support, and operational command of foreign guerrilla formations. The US military had no traditions regarding this type of warfare. During the early Cold War, most top military officers approved the idea of establishing such capabilities in principle, but they did not want to place them under the roof of the Pentagon. In their opinion, the scarce resources were better spent on conventional troops, and moreover, irregular warfare was considered disreputable. A workaround was found when the OPC was established in mid-1948. The OPC was designed to counter the intensifying Soviet subversion in Western Europe through covert action. It was mainly tasked with propaganda and political action. Furthermore, the US military had managed to add guerrilla warfare to the formal mission profile as well. The institutional arrangement was characterized by improvisation and the entanglement of authorities. On the one hand, the OPC was integrated into the CIA's administration. On the other hand, it enjoyed considerable autonomy since the operational guidance for the OPC did not come from the CIA director, but from the state and defense departments. Moreover, during time of war, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, JCS, would assume partial control over covert operations in military theaters. So essentially, the Pentagon had managed to establish guerrilla warfare capabilities, but had outsourced them to the OPC. Yet the paramilitary functions were largely ignored by the OPC itself. Frank Wisner and his staff rather devoted themselves to Cold War operations, especially propaganda and political action targeting cultural organizations and labor unions in Western Europe. However, the US military made increasing demand of the OPC services after their defense strategy for Europe had changed profoundly in late 1949. Previously, the defense plans had been based on withdrawing Allied forces from the continent and the extensive use of nuclear weapons. For various reasons, holding a defense line on the Rhine with conventional forces was now set as the strategic goal. After the first Soviet atomic bomb tests in the fall of 1949, the Pentagon planners calculated that the Soviets would achieve nuclear parity with the United States by about 1952, thereby neutralizing the nuclear shield of the United States. That Stalin would then exploit the Soviet Union's conventional superiority to attack Western Europe was considered a certainty by the Pentagon. So it was an estimated 175 division force part of the Soviets, and fluctuating numbers, but in 49, around 16 Western divisions in Europe. As a result, the US military focused on what they perceived as a fixed D-Day in mid-1952, which made it necessary to strengthen the conventional defense of Europe as quickly as possible. A regular rearmament of the Western European states, however, seemed to require too much time. Instead, Pentagon planners developed the idea of a huge glacis of local guerrilla forces. This was to stretch from Belarus to the Rhine, with Germany and Poland as core areas, and comprised 200,000 fighters in total. They were to be deployed immediately at the outbreak of the war to retard the Soviet advance decisively. And as a consequence, only a small part of the Soviet shock troops would reach the Rhine, while the Western Allies could mobilize their reserves. In this way, the inferiority of the Western troops would be offset. For this reason, the Pentagon planners considered the guerrilla glacis as a crucial element of their European defense strategy. The outbreak of the Korean War in the summer of 1950 then led to fears that Stalin would unleash a world war even before 1952. The Joint Chiefs of Staff subsequently urged the OPC to assign top priority to establishing guerrilla organizations in preparation for a hot war. However, the OPC leadership objected these plans for three reasons. First, the OPC did not consider itself capable of handling the requirements at all. It lacked both expertise and resources. The guerrilla program demanded by the JCS would have required some 10,000 OPC officers and nearly $1 billion according to OPC calculations. However, we know that in 1949, the OPC had only had about 300 personnel and a budget of roughly $5 million. Moreover, in spring of 1950, the State Department had instructed the OPC to extend its covert propaganda and political efforts to the countries behind the Iron Curtain. This expanded Cold War program alone exceeded the capabilities of the OPC, not to mention the additional demands of the JCS. Because in 1951, the OPC's paramilitary division still comprised only 6 employees. Second, OPC officials considered the military plans to be completely unrealistic and dangerous. Beyond that, there existed conceptual disagreements as well. The OPC officials were generally in favor of preparing underground organizations in Europe, but they believed that overt guerrilla warfare should play only a secondary role. Instead, these underground networks were to be organized primarily as political resistance movements, conducting only covert subversion against a Soviet occupation. For that reason, the OPC rejected the notion of throwing underground assets ruthlessly into battle on D-Day for delaying the Soviet advance, as the Pentagon planned. Third, top intelligence officials also feared that the burden of the guerrilla program would lead to an undesired reorientation of the OPC. Frank Wisner wanted to continue focusing on Cold War operations in Western and Eastern Europe. His hope was to avert a Soviet attack by destabilizing the communist bloc. On this issue, Wisner was supported by Walter Bedell Smith, the CIA director. Smith, for his part, feared that a paramilitary expansion of the OPC would in turn place too much emphasis on covert operations within the CIA as a whole, thereby marginalizing the CIA's intelligence gathering capabilities. Despite these concerns, the OPC had to accommodate the prerogatives of the US military in some way. So especially from the fall of 1950 onward, OPC officials frantically began recruiting local groups in Europe as guerrilla assets. The OPC, though, only wanted to spend about 15% of its budget on specific hot war projects. The JCS, on the other hand, demanded a complete redirection of all OPC efforts toward the feared war with the Soviet Union. Beginning in the spring of 1951, the JCS also insisted on gaining insight into the OPC's operations and even claimed command authority over the OPC's paramilitary assets in peacetime. Essentially, the JCS sought to completely transform the OPC into their paramilitary instrument, separate from the regular military apparatus, but still under JCS control in wartime as well as peacetime. In the light of these demands, Wisner and Bedell Smith presented the issue to the National Security Council in the early summer of 1951. The CIA director raised the question of whether the agency should devote itself primarily to foreign intelligence and Cold War projects on a reasonable scale, or be expanded and reorganized to focus on hot war preparations. At this point, Bedell Smith made it clear that he wanted to get rid of the paramilitary responsibilities and turn them over to the military. The Pentagon generals, in turn, did not want a military competitor to emerge under the CIA's roof either, but they were still not willing to assume responsibility for the paramilitary apparatus themselves. So the debate was deadlocked for months. President Truman, however, deplored the administrative bickering in the face of the global threat situation. Therefore, in October 1951, he made a landmark decision. The OPC's budget was massively increased so it could fulfill both Cold War and hot war missions. So instead of a distinct policy decision, the improvised structure of the OPC with its dualistic mission profile was essentially perpetuated. The OPC's competences in the paramilitary field were confirmed, but there was an important difference. Truman and the NSC decided that the OPC was now fully integrated into the CIA's chain of command. The command authority of the US military was restricted to very specific situations during wartime. So in effect, the bureaucratic campaign of the US military to expand the OPC's paramilitary capabilities had been successful, but the Pentagon had thereby lost most of its power over this instrument to the CIA director. So this policy conflict produced several long-term effects. I just want to highlight two of them. Firstly, on the operational level, the CIA used its newfound authority to scale back the guerrilla projects in Europe that had been launched under pressure from the Pentagon. However, the CIA's course correction came too late. The operations were so flawed because of the hasty setup that many projects nevertheless failed or were exposed in 1952, most notably in Germany and Poland. The large-scale plan of a European guerrilla glacis was a disastrous failure. Subsequently, the CIA limited itself to very rudimentary war preparations in Europe, mostly based on a single-agent approach. Secondly, preparing for war in Europe against the Soviets had been the original impetus for expanding the OPC's paramilitary capabilities. The operational and strategic importance of these efforts in Europe diminished after the failures in 1952. However, the ongoing debate and Truman's decision still led to a permanent change of the CIA's basic structure. In early 52, a specific war plans division was established within the agency, and the OPC in general now had a staff of 6,000 and a budget of $400 million. From that time on, the CIA had a paramilitary apparatus at its disposal and used it in other areas of operation than Europe. For example, by the late 1960s, the entire CIA directorate responsible for espionage and covert operations comprised 6,000 personnel, and 1,800 of them were paramilitary officers who had operated in Laos, Vietnam, or Cuba. I want to conclude briefly. In contrast to scholarly literature, I argue that the historical driving force behind the paramilitarization of the CIA was neither the agency nor the OPC leadership, but the US military with its fixation on preparing for a hot war in Europe. Frank Wisner and Walter Bedell Smith had wanted to gear the CIA toward intelligence gathering and covert operations in peacetime. Ironically, the NSC decision in fall 1951 to strengthen the CIA's authority in the field of paramilitary operations and the following expansion of capabilities had neither been desired by the Pentagon nor by the CIA leadership. Essentially, the Pentagon's effort to transform the OPC into an auxiliary apparatus had backfired and created a new competitor in the military field. Wisner and Bedell Smith, in turn, had ended up with a paramilitary empire they had never wanted.